Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, welcome back, folks. Like I said in our last podcast on the 1886 Benz Patent Motor Wagon, we are doing a series of most influential cars from each decade to commemorate our launch on Instagram. I know it's not huge, but I will like to report that the GSMC Car Podcast currently has 32 followers on Instagram as of the recording of this podcast. So please continue to spread the word, continue to get your folks to like us, to subscribe, to follow, whatever the term is, because we are on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Spreaker. We have an Instagram and we have a Twitter page too at GSMC_car podcast. So if you search us on both of those social media sites, you will see us, and hopefully there will be a Facebook page coming soon. And we're also on YouTube as well, if I didn't already mention that. So let's get started. Keeping with our series on most influential cars from each decade. Last time we discussed the 1886 Benz Patent Motor Wagon, the very first car ever made. At least car in the most modern traditional sense, with an internal combustion engine. There were vehicles that were self-powered before, but we already made that distinction. A lot of them were locomotives. They were steam vehicles that either operated on track, some of them operated on the road, but they were not a car in the traditional sense. So for this podcast, we are going to be discussing cars in the most traditional senses. Of course, not all cars have internal combustion engines. Some of them have steam engines, others are electric. So we will be discussing all sorts of cars, but anything that is fitting under the definition of car will be discussed. And really, the only time that it really matters what is technically a car and what is technically not a car is in the early days of automotive, engineering and whatnot, in the 1880s, in the 1890s. By the time the 1900s rolled around, people pretty much had an idea of what a car was. So this is still the 1890s over here, and today we're going to be discussing the 1894 Duryea Motor Wagon. Okay. What is a Duryea Motor Wagon? Let me introduce you first to the Duryea Motor Wagon Company. We're going to be discussing them in segment 1. We are going to be discussing the specifications of the 1893 Duryea Motor Wagon in segment 2. In segment 3, we're going to be discussing some other cars that were present in the 1890s, as well as some history for you, so you can really gain a perspective of what the 1890s were like. I mean, right now, 1890 was 131 years ago. So that was a long time ago, folks. I mean, just keep that in the back of your mind. And then in segment 4, obviously, you're going to be hearing my thoughts, why I choose to do this car, why I chose to do this podcast, and things of that sort, and what I think why this car is so influential, essentially. So, anyways, let me introduce you to the Duryea Motor Wagon Company. It was established in 1895, though the first car was built in 1893. A lot of times in this early time period, two people would get together, one or two people would get together, they would build a car, and then they'd be like, hey, we're pretty good at doing this, so why don't we start a car company? and then they start a car company. In the early days of American motoring, there were over 300 car companies, easily. And then just like Jay Leno said, I'm going to quote him, about every year, 10-15% would drop off. And then now we're left with basically 3 American car companies. Unless you're going to be counting brands, then we have, probably 10 or so. I mean, let's just take a quick survey. We got Cadillac, we got Buick, we've got Chevy, we've got GMC. Those are all the GM ones. We've got Ford and Lincoln, which are the Ford ones. And then under Fiat Chrysler, the American marks are Chrysler, Dodge, Ram, and Jeep. And then we've got the independent Tesla. I mean, we've got 11 American car companies. So imagine in the early days of motoring, you had some, I mean, oh my goodness gracious, you had so many different car companies. You had Duryea, for example. You had Maxwell. Maxwell turned into Chrysler. You've got, you had AMC, but AMC wasn't one of the very, very early ones. There was ABC. That was an American car company. There was Stanley Steamer. Stanley Steamer makes carpet cleaner. They first started making cars, actually. They made steam cars, hence the name. There was White. White was a steam automobile company. All these are American makes, by the way. There was Haynes Apperson. Haynes Apperson, I'm going to mention one of their cars in this podcast. There were so many different car companies. And of course, some of them got sold, some of them merged, others just went bankrupt, and no other car company really succeeded them. I mean, it was like the Wild West of automobiles. Nobody knew exactly what they wanted to do. Everybody was just experimenting with different things. Some things stuck, some things didn't stick. I mean, heck, in the early days of automotive engineering, there was a car with 8 wheels, because the man who invented the Octo car, what it was called, it was like, oh my gosh, if I put 8 wheels on a car, maybe it'll reduce tire wear so people wouldn't have to change tires so often. I mean, it's crazy, crazy things. But anyway, Duryea wasn't known for doing any of this crazy foolishness, however. So they were the first American car company, or actually, first American company to build gasoline automobiles. Now, mind you, the Benz Patent Motor Wagon was a diesel car. They didn't start using gasoline in cars until around the 1890s. Because, just a bit of history for you all. Gasoline was a byproduct of some oil refineries that refine oil. For example, there's several, things that you can make from crude oil. You can make gasoline, you can make diesel, you can make kerosene, you can make petroleum jelly. It depends on the long chain of hydrocarbons. So I believe it was like in kerosene plants or whatever, gasoline was like a byproduct that was considered a waste product until someone, I guess, took it. Now, don't quote me on this. I'm just remembering this from a documentary that I watched on Standard Oil that was owned by John D. Rockefeller. I mean, it wasn't even about this. It was about John D. Rockefeller, which, Standard Oil. But point is that I'm trying to make is that gasoline was a byproduct, and it wasn't until someone thought that was like, hey, this might be useful, then they started making engines to run off of gasoline. Diesel was the fuel for the very, very first automobiles. Granted, Duryea was one of the first automobiles because this is still the 1890s. I mean, they built their first car in 1893. The first car was built in 1886. There was only 7 years between the launch of the very first automobile and the Duryea. But nonetheless, this car was the first American car to use gasoline. And frankly, it was the first American car in general. Charles and Frank Duryea, their first 10 vehicles were the absolute very first cars to be sold in America. I remember seeing one of these specimens in 2019 when I visited the Tallahassee Automobile Museum with my friend Alana. I was on a road trip for 2 weeks. Easily 2 weeks. I mean, it was about 13 days. And my first stop was in Tallahassee because I lived in Tampa at the time. So I drove 4 hours to Tallahassee. And then I told Alana I've been wanting to go to the Tallahassee Automobile Museum since the first time I had ever been to Tallahassee when I was in high school. and I was doing the Poetry Out Loud competition that was in Tallahassee. And so we stopped by a Tallahassee Automobile Museum. And then as we're browsing through the cars, we come across this car. It is old. It is rickety. I mean, the wood boards are rotten, but it is an 1894 Duryea. An 1894 Duryea Motor Wagon. And it says simply, 1894 Duryea. First car in America. I'm like, oh my gosh. It was the actual specimen, y'all. This was not a replica. This was not a kit car. This was not a fake. This car was built by Charles and Frank Duryea. And it was one of the first cars built in America. It was the first car built in America. Imagine this. This car launched the largest car market on Earth. I mean, we're not the most populous country on Earth. That title goes to China. But as far as how many cars, as far as how many cars we have here in America, we far outsell cars here in America than anywhere else on Earth. I mean, the American car market is huge. This car started it all. First car to be built and sold in America. That's amazing. So anyway, I see this 1894 Duryea, and I'm just starting to think. At that time, that car was, that was 2019. That car was 125 years old. Right now, it is 127 years old. So imagine you, 127 years ago was the first car here in America. This man who owned the Tallahassee Car Museum, his name is Duryea Moore. Duryea Moore traded 12 cars plus an undisclosed amount of cash to get his hands on this car to put it in his museum. That's how valuable and rare this thing is. I mean, mind you, between 1893 and I believe, 1903 or something like that, for the first 10 years, these people, Charles and Frank Duryea, only produced about 10 cars. Now imagine how many of them are actually still surviving of the Duryea Motor Wagons. I mean, there were other cars that they made. There was the Duryea Gem that never actually went into production. That was the last car built, I believe, by Charles Duryea after the company split in the 1890s. In the early 1900s. But this, imagine how many of these cars may still be around today. Because mind you, in those days, what a car was, it was essentially, in the truest sense of a term, a horseless carriage. What were carriages made of? Wood. Would last 120-something years while being next to heat from an engine? Most likely not. If the heat from the engine is not going to stress the wood, termites are probably going to get to it once the car falls into disrepair, because I can guarantee you nobody's driving a wooden car from the 1890s as a daily driver and they're keeping up with maintenance. They're all either garage queens or, sitting in some automobile museum or probably rotting away in some barn waiting to be discovered. Nobody's driving this thing as their daily driver. So obviously these vehicles are going to fall in disrepair. The ones that are in museums probably don't run. And then he finds this one all original. Like all original. Like the seat was original. Everything was original on this car. He traded 12 cars plus an undisclosed amount of cash just to get it into his museum. First car built in America. That is truly something that's bragging rights, honestly. I find that you could probably look it up, the Tallahassee Car Museum and their website. You could probably see it on their website. Of course, they're not paying me to do this. This is not a sponsorship. I know I probably should legally say that, but I'm just really excited to tell you all about where you all can go see this for yourself. I don't know where y'all are located. I don't know if y'all are in Florida, if y'all are in Texas, if y'all are in the South, anywhere. But if you're not even in the South, if you find your way in Florida and you happen to be in Tallahassee and you are a car enthusiast, go and visit the Tallahassee Automobile Museum so you can feast your eyes upon the first car built in America. First car sold in America. And this was so many first. I mean, this should be a badge of national pride, honestly. This is the car that started it all here in America. I mean, there ain't nothing like this. So moving on. First car built in America. And it was the very first car to win an American race. Get this. The 1894 Duryea won the Chicago Times Herald race. It was a race put on by the Chicago Times Herald, which, suggesting by the name, I'm guessing is a newspaper. And it was the first U.S. car race in which any of the cars actually finished. So this has been dubbed as the first car race, because all the other ones were attempts at a car race, but none of the cars actually finished. Because, mind you, cars were very experimental in the 1890s, so a lot of cars were not reliable, and it's perfectly conceivable that these cars didn't finish this race. This was the first one to actually finish a race, and this has been dubbed as the very first car race here in America. This is the car race that started it all. I mean, the race was 54 miles long. And I believe it was Charles Duryea. It was either Charles or Frank. I'm going to say Charles. He averaged about 7.5 miles per hour. Imagine this. Going 54 miles, averaging 7.5 miles per hour. It would have taken him just about 7 hours and 12 minutes without stopping to finish the race. 54 miles. Let me put that into perspective for people who live in Southwest Florida, which might not be many of you, but this is the place that I live, so this is the only place that I can put that into perspective. 54 miles is probably from Cape Coral to Port Charlotte. Yeah, that's about 54 miles. You can do that in 45 minutes nowadays. It took him 7 hours and 12 minutes. If you're going to be driving 7 hours and 12 minutes nonstop from Cape Coral, you will probably be past Tallahassee. Past Tallahassee, probably near Panama City. Yeah, honestly, probably halfway between, somewhere up in the Panhandle nonetheless. Somewhere a part of the Panhandle. That's probably where you will be in that time period, if you were to drive for 7 hours and 12 minutes nonstop. In those days, he could only do 54 miles in 7 hours and 12 minutes. But he finished the race. And the good thing is, Duryeas were known for their reliability. So that's always a wonderful addition that I should always add, because cars in those days, reliability was a rare thing. By the end of the century, the brothers parted ways. Charles produced cars up until 1917. Frank produced cars until 1927. Duryea automobiles never achieved their envisioned success, but they launched the beginning of what is now known as the largest car market on Earth. And that is precisely why I chose to put this car as the most influential car of the 1890s. Of course, there were other influential cars. You'll learn about some of the other cars that existed in this time period that really are like runner-ups to this name. But I will discuss those in segment 3. But anyway, it's the end of segment 1, so please stay tuned for segment 2, in which I'm going to be discussing the specifications of the 1893 Duryea Motor Wagon. Stay tuned, folks.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
All right, welcome back, folks. So, in segment 2, we're going to be discussing the specifications of the 1893 Duryea Motor Wagon. I introduced you to the Duryea Motor Wagon company in segment 1, some of their successes, some of the things that made them famous, and why I basically chose them as the most influential car of the 1890s. So let's get started. Okay, so, like I mentioned, cars of this time period were, in the truest sense, horseless carriages. I mean, this car, Charles and Frank Duryea, the story goes, they bought a horse buggy for $70, which, let me just calculate that real quick, as far as $70 in today's money adjusted for inflation. Okay, so the year was 1893. So let me pull up my inflation calculator here real quick. You all should really get these. If you're a car enthusiast, for you to know how much cars cost back in those days, I mean, it would be really. And then, so, whoops. And then $70. They bought a horse carriage for $2,021.70. In 2020 dollars. It hasn't updated for 2021 yet. So they bought it for about $2,000. They bought a horse carriage, and then they adapted it to receive their 4 horsepower single cylinder engine that had a friction transmission, whatever that's supposed to mean, a spray carburetor. I guess it was like a carburetor, I guess a spray carburetor. It sprayed gasoline to the cylinder. And then a low-tension ignition, which I also don't have any idea what that means. This car was the very first successful American race car. It entered and won in the first race in American history, just like I told you all in the last segment, and in many others as well. There was even an armored car version as well, being the first American armored car, to exist. So get this. You've got this car, and they, very, very simple by today's standards. But mind you, there's a reason why these things were so successful in a sense, is because, get this, I mean, these things were so successful because they were the only cars that existed at this time. I mean, not the only cars that existed in the world, but the only cars that were existing in America. If you wanted a car in America before the Duryea, you either had to order one from Germany or probably make one yourself. Because Germany was the place that had the cars. France also had the cars. So I guess the very, very, very richest people could have like a Benz Velo, imported from Germany, or Panhard de Levasseur from France, and then, have it in America, or Fiat from Italy here in America. This was the first American car. Like, by virtue of being American, it already makes it more affordable. Because even though this may not have been a people's car, like, the Ford Model T, or even the Oldsmobile Curved Dash Runabout that came out a few years later in 1903, or the Volkswagen Beetle that would come out in the 1940s, but still, this was, by virtue, probably the most affordable car you can get at the time. Because every other car, you would have to import it from Europe, because Americans were not making cars yet. And you all know as well as I do how stubborn Americans are. I mean, Americans are a stubborn people. We really are. I'm not going to even try to slice it and, and make it seem, politically correct. We're stubborn. We're stubborn. We don't take the change very likely. We tend to be a very conservative people. Not conservative politically. I'm not getting into politics. But conservative as in, like, not wanting change very quickly. So imagine this. You get a conservative group of people who have always been riding on horses and having their horses pull buggies or stagecoaches or what have you, wagons or anything of that sort. And then you start introducing a car. That is huge. I mean, I can guarantee, I remember watching an old movie back in like middle school. I think in like, my middle school language arts class. There was some reason why we were watching this movie. And in the movie, it depicted a race between a car and a horse. And the thing is, People believed so much in the horse and buggy that they would race cars all the time. And of course, the first cars were unreliable. And this car in the movie was a steam car. So the boiler had overheated or some foolishness like that. So the horse ended up winning the race. But it's just to show you that even in that depiction, Americans distrust of automobiles when they first came out. Now for Duryea to grab the bull by the horns and just start making cars here in America. And just, I guess, in a sense, to prove that Americans can make cars too. To prove that, hey, look, you can make a decent car. Your car doesn't have to be terribly unreliable. The car will finally replace the horse. It was revolutionary. It was revolutionary because you're taking a stubborn group of people who are very resistant to change, who have been historically resistant to change, and then you're introducing a giant change. Granted, people were probably still riding around with horses and buggies well into the 1900s, maybe even to the 1910s, in some rural areas, maybe even into the 1920s, frankly. But this establishment of the Duryea Motor Wagon Company, even though in 1927 none of the Duryea brothers were making cars anymore, this establishment of this company, how would I put it exactly? It established the end of the horse and buggy here in America. Even though it wasn't the one that officially killed the horse and buggy, it established the end of it. Because once Americans started making cars and they got good at it, and then they started making them affordable for people to buy horse and buggy goodness. Because you don't have to feed a car like you have to feed a horse. You only have to put gas in a car, and the gas lasts a long time. Gas does not, the feed for a horse does not last as much. Cars don't die. Cars don't die. Yeah, they need maintenance. A car could stop running, but it doesn't die. A horse eventually will die. It's a living being. A horse can only go so fast. A horse can only produce so much horsepower, in a sense. A horse can only do so much. A horse is not that practical. And of course, you could have a giant wagon or a stagecoach. One horse can't pull that. You need 6 horses to pull a stagecoach. So it only made sense that cars were going to become more and more practical as the days went on than horses were. It was just a fact in the matter. And the fact that the Duryea brothers were able to jumpstart that here in America, because who knows, if it had not been for them, production of the car in America could have been delayed 10 years. And I know 10 years doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think of it, how much cars were advancing in Europe? I mean, heck, by the 1890s, the French had already developed a 4-cylinder engine and a front-wheel drive car. This was the 1890s. Less than 20 years after the internal combustion engine had been invented, and less than 10 years after the first car had been invented, the French already managed to produce a 4-cylinder engine and a front-wheel drive car. So imagine if the Duryea brothers had not started, American car production here in the United States, how behind we would have been compared to Europe. These guys, they paved the way for the Oldsmobile Curved Dash developed by Ransom Olds. They paved the way for the Buick by David Dunbar Buick in 1899. They paved the way for Henry Ford with his quadricycle in 1896 and eventually his first Model A in 1903. That paved the way for what's his face? I know his name. He started Lincoln and Cadillac. Oh my gosh. How can I forget this man's name? Point is, they paved the way for the greatest American car companies. I mean, Henry M. Leland, that's what his name was. Henry M. Leland in 1903 to start the Cadillac Motor Company from the remnants of the Henry Ford Company. I mean, these guys, they are forgotten by history, but Duryea ought to be remembered. But let's go back to the specifications of the car. Like I said, true horseless carriage. There was no steering wheel on these cars. There was a steering tiller that was used instead. Now, what is a steering tiller? A steering tiller is literally a rod that moves from side to side inside the car that turns the front wheels by like direct connection. So like if you're sitting in this car, you should probably sit in the middle because you have to grab a handle of the steering tiller and then turn it to the left if you want to go left, and then turn it to the right if you want to go right. It's not a steering wheel that, is connected by a bunch of gear linkages or rack and pinion and you can turn it so many times and the wheels turn. No. You're directly turning the wheels. Of course, there was no power steering on these cars. There was no electric power steering. It was a direct connection. But the tiller did its job. There's just one thing I wanted to mention, however. The wheels on this car were 54 inches in diameter. Now, if any of y'all like rims on your cars, I'm not a huge fan of big rims on your cars because it introduces a whole host of issues to your car. But if you like big rims, imagine having 54-inch rims on your car. That was standard equipment on the Duryea Motor Wagon. Now, of course, these were not blinged out chrome rims or gold rims or rims with all sorts of foolishness on there. They were a wooden rim, obviously, but the reason why they were 54 inches in diameter is because cars in this day had to have such high ground clearance to accommodate for very bad roads. Now imagine this is before the interstate system, and paved roads were few and far between. And even then, paved roads in America at the time were probably cobblestone, honestly. So very bumpy. Or maybe they had ruts in them to guide carriages and whatnot. These were not automotive-friendly roads. So especially if you didn't live in the city and you lived even in the suburbs, or were there even suburbs at this time? Not really. It was more like city and country. So if you lived in the country and you had to commute to the city, like you needed something with 54-inch rims so you can get over potholes, so you can get over rocks, so you can get over ridges and all sorts of other foolishness because the roads were just that bad. That's the justification for 54-inch rims on basically a glorified horse carriage. So anyway, moving on. I mean, that's basically the specifications and really the impact of the Duryea Motor Wagon and the Duryea Motor Wagon Company. I mean, this is something that you really have to take into consideration when you're talking about American car history. Influential cars can have loads of technology, or influential cars can be historically significant. In this one, it's not like it was coming out with new technologies. Oh, this has this has that, blah, blah, blah. It's not really all that technologically advanced, frankly. It's just a single cylinder mounted on a horse carriage. But it's the historical significance that really outshines so many cars on this list. So, anyway, moving on. Please stay tuned for segment 3, in which I'm going to be discussing some of the other cars that would have been considered for this podcast, really, because they were also influential cars of the same time period. And we're going to be discussing some history that was going on in the 1890s. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So, in segment 2, we discussed the specifications of the Duryea Motor Wagon. In segment 3, we're going to be discussing some other cars that existed in this time period. So let's get started. In 1892, there was the Daimler motorized carriage. This was the first car produced by Gottlieb Daimler, or Daimler, however you want to pronounce it, and Wilhelm Maybach. So these guys, obviously by their names, they were German guys. So a brief history on the Daimler motorized carriage. Now, between Daimler, Gottlieb Daimler, and Karl Benz, some sources are going to tell you that Gottlieb Daimler produced the first car. Other people are going to tell you that Karl Benz did it. Now, here's where the discrepancy lies. It depends on what the definition of car is and how it's patented. Because Karl Benz produced the first car that was eligible for patent. And let me tell you this. Gottlieb Daimler did produce a car around the same time that Benz did. But his car was a motorized stagecoach. Now, you would say, but David, that's a car. It has a motor. It is, but it isn't. Let me tell you why. And, this might be a tad bit hypocritical, considering that the Duryea brothers basically did what Gottlieb Daimler did. They bought an old horse carriage and mounted an engine to it. However, they did that in America. Goodness, I don't know what German patent laws were at the time. I'm not German, and I don't really know any German people that would know what, patent laws were at the end of the, 19th century in the 1890s. So I wouldn't know. But get this. The reason why it wasn't eligible for patent and thus probably the title of very first car ever made was because it wasn't designed from the ground up to accommodate an internal combustion engine. It was modified, dare I say hot-rodded. He took a vehicle that already existed, a horse-drawn vehicle, which was a stagecoach, and then he basically removed the horse and mounted an engine into it. Thus, a motorized stagecoach. This very first car that Gottlieb Daimler produced in the late 1880s was not considered a car. Because in order for it to be considered a car, and I guess this is German patent law, it had to be designed from the ground up to be a car. Karl Benz did that with the Benz patent motor wagon. And Karl Benz had been working silently on his internal combustion engine since the 1870s. And by the time the 1880s rolled around, he invented a car, which was designed from the ground up to be a car. This was not something that he took from someone else and then hot-rodded it by putting an engine into it. He built the car himself, and he built the engine himself, and then he patented the technology like 3 months before Gottlieb Daimler even had a claim to even his motorized, stagecoach. So to dissolve the dispute here, I don't know what to end the dispute, to resolve the dispute, that's the word I'm looking for. To resolve the dispute here, Karl Benz unequivocally first automobile. I mean, not first self-moving vehicle, but first automobile. And then Gottlieb Daimler had his own car, but this car was the Daimler motorized carriage in 1892. In this time period, in the 1890s, Fiat began. Fiat, 1899, they came out with the Fiat 4 horsepower. First car produced by Fiat. As you all know, Fiat is still producing cars to this very day. Fiat, you would have heard this in my podcast on Italian cars. Fiat has been around since 1899, and Fiat is still producing cars to this very day. Fiat is a very old car company, probably one of the oldest continuing car companies on earth, because you got Mercedes-Benz, which is the oldest, that started with Benz back in 1888. I believe that's when Benz, officially started his company, even though he produced his first car in 1886. Buick in 1899 by David Dunbar Buick. You had Cadillac in 1903. The Ford Motor Company in 1904. Not to be confused with the Henry Ford Company that was started in 1896. That's no longer around. I mean, those are probably the top 4 or 5 oldest car companies on earth, if I were to just give you something right now that are still producing cars. Oldsmobile, if they were still producing cars, would have been considered the oldest American car company because I believe they started producing cars in 1897. But that's, they're dead now. And then there was Haynes Apperson. Haynes Apperson, they made their first car in 1894. It was founded by a pioneer of metallurgy, Elwood Hayes. Now get this, Elwood Hayes invented what is called stellite. It's like a wear-resistant alloy with elements of chrome and magnesium and all. It's supposed to be a really strong metal that's supposed to be very wear resistant and very corrosion resistant, because in those days, I mean, stainless steel had not yet been invented yet. So if you were making something out of steel obviously made of iron and tin, I believe is what steel is, an alloy of, is prone to rust. So, he worked on stellite. He invented stellite, which was a wear-resistant alloy, and he worked on many types of stainless steel as well. So he was a pioneer of metallurgy, and I don't doubt that found their way into his cars in the 1890s as well. But let's take a break from the cars for a little bit, and let's talk about world history in the 1890s. So the 1890s were marked by severe economic depression, sparked by the Panic of 1893. Panic of 1893, basically like, stock market crash. Same thing that happened like 1929, of course, on a smaller scale in 1893. But this was referred to as the Great Panic of 1893. So economic depression. I can only imagine that this affected car production in some way, shape, or form. I mean, but nonetheless, car production, still took off in the 1890s. And this decade was known as the gay 90s. Not gay by our definition today, meaning homosexual, but gay as in like happy, carefree, full of merriment and optimism. That was considered the gay 90s. So the gay 90s were a time in which, everybody was optimistic. Everybody was this. Everybody was that. I mean, everything was going to be fine, which I find it ironic because there was also a great, a depression, an economic depression going on at the same time. So I don't know. But anyway, this was known as the gay 90s. Of course, it wasn't known as the gay 90s back in the 90s. It was known as the gay 90s in the 1920s, looking back in retrospect onto the 1890s. So, there was the Spanish-American War. There was the Philippine-American War, because at around this time, Philippines were still owned by Spain. But the Americans ended up taking ownership, colonizing the Philippines. So thus creating this, Asian, Spanish, American kind of Latin thing that the Filipinos have going on here, which is really awesome. And then this was the era of the first Sino-Japanese War too. Japan, I think, invaded Korea. Korea was like a puppet state by China, like the Qing dynasty or whatever, and then they started a war with Japan because they saw that as an aggressive move. So basically, China and Japan are having it out with each other over Korea. Sino-Japanese War in a nutshell. And then, get this, in New Zealand grants women the right to vote in 1893. One of the first countries on earth, undoubtedly, to do that. In 1893, New Zealand grants women the right to vote. It took American women until 1920 to gain the right to vote, which was 27 years after people in New Zealand were able to vote as women. And then there was the bike boom, hundreds of bicycles being built. I mean, which I find it very funny, because you would think conventional knowledge would lead you to believe that, cars weren't produced in large numbers in the 1890s, so everybody must have gotten around on bikes too. Not really. I mean, bikes do precede the car, but not by much. I mean, you all know all this penny farthing foolishness. I mean, the bike was like the 6-foot tall front wheel and then the really tiny back wheel, and that you basically used to stand up on it. That came around, I think, in the 1870s. And that was one of the first bicycles. I mean, I believe the first bicycle was maybe produced in the 1830s or the 1840s, so maybe 20, 30 years before the car, but commercially successful bicycles came around probably just 10 years before the car. So right around this time, bicycle technology was taking off as well. This was what was known as the bike boom. Several companies across, Europe and America were making bicycles by the hundreds of thousands and selling them to people because the bicycle, technology was just, taking off, and it was very successful, and it was very successful. It was rapidly advancing. And of course, a bike is a much simpler vehicle than a car. So I guess bike technology was able to advance much quicker than car technology, as you all obviously should know. And then there was the Panhard Elevation, which I speak French. I should be able to pronounce that, but I don't know how to pronounce that. Panhard Elevation? I don't know. That's how I'm going to say it. And then this created the first 4-cylinder engine, this company. And this was actually my immediate answer to, what am I going to do as the most influential car of the 1890s? To which I held back a little bit, and I was like, you know what, let me look up, a list of cars in the 1890s and go through them to find out which one really had the most impact. And really, this arguably could have had more impact on the Duryea from a technological standpoint. But from a historical standpoint and from a business standpoint, the Duryea has this thing blown out of the water because the Duryea established the first car sales here in America, and America is the largest car market on earth. Undoubtedly, nobody can argue with that. The largest car market on earth. Americans own more cars than anybody else. I mean, us in our family, my dad alone owns like 5 cars. That's unheard of in some parts of the world. In Japan, an average person doesn't even own a car. And if you're going to own a car, you own 1 car. It's not like America where an average person could have 2, 3 cars. I mean, America is the largest car market on earth. So between the Panhard and the Duryea, I was like, the Duryea had a more historical influence on what was going on in the world, as opposed to the Panhard. Panhard, technologically, for sure, this was the first 4-cylinder engine. I mean, the Duryea had a single-cylinder engine. It was being made at around the same time. But the Duryea was the first car built and produced in America. So, established the American car market. I mean, there you have it right there. So, please stay tuned for segment 4, in which I'm going to be discussing my thoughts, and I'm going to tell you, more about how I feel about the Duryea and how everything is going, and I'll update you on our social media pages as well. So, please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So, here are my thoughts on the Duryea Motor Wagon Company and the 1894 Duryea Motor Wagon, first car built in America. Let me just go, and say why I chose the Duryea. I know I sort of teased this at the end of the last segment, but let me go more in depth. Why I chose the Duryea. I also considered the Benz Velo, and I considered the Panhard et Levasseur. Benz Velo, the reason why I didn't choose the Benz Velo is because the Benz Patent Motor Wagon was the one that started it all. Granted, the Benz Patent Motor Wagon was a three-wheeled car. The Benz Velo was Benz's first four-wheel car, but the Benz Patent Motor Wagon had already established Carl Benz as the inventor of the automobile, the first automobile company in the world, the first automobile in the world. I mean, it had already, the Benz Velo lives in the shadow of the Benz Patent Motor Wagon. Granted, there were technological advances. There were things that came. It was more successful commercially. There were more built, all the things. But it lives in the shadow of the 1883 Benz Patent Motor Wagon. I mean, granted, I don't know how many car enthusiasts know that it was Carl Benz and the 1883 Benz Patent Motor Wagon that actually, not 1883, 1886 Benz Patent Motor Wagon that started, cars. I don't know how many car enthusiasts know that, but if you know anybody who's really privy to car history, they would tell you that the 1890s Benz Velo was just, I guess it was the successor to the Benz Patent Motor Wagon, but it wasn't that special in terms of everything going on in cars at that time period. I mean, I considered it, but I was like, nah, the Benz Patent Motor Wagon is really the Benz that takes the cake. And I also considered the Panhard et Levasseur. The Panhard et Levasseur, that was my immediate thought. I was like, yes, Panhard et Levasseur, I'm going to do that. At the same time, I was like, let me look in some more cars. Because at first, I wasn't sure if this car was produced during the 1890s. I was thinking it was a 1900s car, in which they were still being produced in the 1900s, but it was first developed in the 1890s. But not only that, I was like, I need to do my more research because I don't want the whole thing to be just European cars. Because when you really think of it, European cars have always been ahead of the game as far as, not always, I can't say always, but for the very early decades had been ahead of the game in terms of technology, reliability, influence, sales, blah, blah, blah. They had always been ahead of the game in the early days. It wasn't until around, by the time Cadillac came into the game, Cadillac invented the electric starter in like the late teens, early 20s. Cadillac, had so many technological advances that had really put Europe on the back burner as far as developments in car technology. But as far as technology goes, it would have definitely been the Panhard et Levasseur. Panhard et Levasseur, first four-cylinder engine. I mean, come on. First four-cylinder engine. Most cars today have four-cylinder engines. They have the Panhard et Levasseur company to thank because of their four-cylinder engines. They were the first ones to develop it. And four cylinders back in the 1890s might as well be 12 cylinders today. I mean, think of it. When most cars had one cylinder, you get 4 times the amount of cylinders in that same time period. When most cars today have 4 cylinders, 3 times the amount of cylinders is 12 cylinders. 4 times the amount of cylinders is 16 cylinders, in which we have 16-cylinder engines. They're not V16s, they're W16s, but still, we have 16-cylinder engines. It might as well be that. I mean, just the technology and the everything, the wow factor, like, oh my God, 4 cylinders. I mean, that's crazy. 4 cylinders, that's insane. That's some insane foolishness back in the 1890s. I mean, like, whoa, like, we're talking future here, folks. And I'm not even being sarcastic. I mean, like, think of it. When your car averages 7.5 miles per hour and you've got 1 measly cylinder and 4 horsepower, and then in that same time period across the Atlantic Ocean in France, they're making a 4-cylinder engine, which God knows how many horsepower. The thing could have had like 16 or 20 horsepower. Like, oh my gosh, that's insane. And for that time period, absolutely insane. So I didn't choose the Panhard, though, because I chose the Duryea to make a point. To make a point that technology is not only what causes a car to be the most influential car of its decade. I mean, think of it. The Volkswagen Beetle, which we can undoubtedly say was probably one of the most influential cars of all time. I mean, you know, it wasn't a technological powerhouse. It was very simple. And it was the fact that it was so simple and cheap to produce that made it the most influential car of its time period. So now get this. The Panhard de Levasseur, nobody knows about Panhard anymore. It's been forgotten, much like Duryea. And not only that, this was a French car. The French car market is a big car market. This is true. It's not nearly as large as the American car market. Get this, France is only about the size of Texas. So France is a huge country. But think about Texas. Texas is just one of 50 states here in the United States. America is infinitely larger than France. America has infinitely more people than France. America has infinitely more influence in the modern world than France. I mean, granted, at this time, France was still pretty much a powerhouse because when you looked at, the map of the world in the 1890s, I mean, and you looked at France still had a pretty good empire going on there. But still, I mean, not nearly as large as the United States. The Duryea was the first car built in the United States. First race car, first road-going car, first armored car, first in so many different disciplines that one couldn't even hope to surpass the influence that the Duryea has and still continues to have. I mean, it's crazy, man. It's crazy. Duryea was definitely the choice for this podcast, but let me move on. Why I think the 1890s cemented the car production in the world. This is what I think. Get this. Like I had said, you took a population of very resistant people such as Americans, and you introduced the car. A lot of times they were like, nope, I don't believe in that contraption. I'm going to continue riding my horse and buggy. Very much that Americans are so resistant to so many things. I mean, you get a whole sect of people out there who don't believe in vaccines. Vaccines that have been proven again and again and again by science. And the majority of anti-vaxxers, what are they? They're Americans. They don't believe in it. They don't want to do it. They don't believe in that foolishness. Once again, very resistant people. Things that have been proven to be good for them, things that have been proven to be better for them, things that have been proven to be the way of the future, the way that the world is going. Americans are simply extremely resistant to all of that. And they want nothing to do with it. This is how the very first cars were here in America. And the fact that Duryea was even able to make cars and to sell them and to actually be modestly successful before the company dissolved is an amazing thing. So the 1890s cemented car production because it was in this decade. Mind you, they had been, not they as in the Duryea brothers, but they as in general, car manufacturers, engineers of this time period. People have been toying with the idea of a self-propelled vehicle since 1763 with Nicolas de Cugnot, which invented the Fardier de Cugnot, a Frenchman once again. He had invented a steam tractor that was meant to haul cannons. Granted, it was 2 miles per hour. There was a giant boiler on the front that was prone to explosions, but it was a self-propelled vehicle. So now, mind you, since 1763, that predates the American Revolution, people had been toying with the idea of a self-propelled vehicle, and frankly, probably since before then, but that was the first self-propelled vehicle. So you had been toying with this idea of a self-propelled vehicle, and for the longest amount of time, People just couldn't get it right. People couldn't get it right. They first started out with steam. Steam was dangerous because steam boilers could explode if they were not built properly, or after wear and tear, they could explode. And steam was loud. Steam was very heavy. It wasn't until probably the 1890s, early 1900s that companies like Stanley Steamer and White really refined steam technology to the point where in those eras, steam cars were the best cars. They were fastest, they were most quietest, they were the most reliable. I mean, those probably were the best cars, the steam cars of those time periods. But for the first several decades, the first 100 years or so of steam technology, I mean, the horse and buggy still proved to be more practical for everyday use. Of course, you had steam trains that were really connecting the world, but the horse and buggy for personal use, for commuting, for going to market, for doing your regular everyday activities that didn't require a great deal of long distance travel, horse and buggy was still the most practical. Until you get around the 1880s, in which the first car is invented that's actually viable. And then you get the 1890s, in which several cars are being produced by several different companies. It's beginning to smell the end of the horse and buggy age. Because people have been experimenting with cars in similar, contraptions for the past 130-something years at that point. And then they finally have something that doesn't need a horse and conceivably will never need a horse. That's where it begins to get good. That's where car history really takes off. This era was like, oh my gosh, we have finally beat the horse. We finally beat the horse, and the horse is going to be dead. We beat the horse is dying, the horse will soon be dead. We will no longer have to deal with horses because we've got a handy-dandy automobile. The 1890s was the decade that secured that. Moving on. The Duryea had largely been forgotten. And I wanted to make this podcast because this should be a symbol of national pride for us Americans. That the 1893-1894 Duryea Motor Wagon was the very first car built in our country. And that established the vast American car culture. I get chilled speaking about it. The American car culture. NASCAR, drag racing, muscle cars, luxury cars, Cadillac, Lincoln, Packard, this, that, Oldsmobile, Thunderbird, Firebird, all of this. All of the cars that we love so much. The Tri-5, the Tri-5 Chevys. I mean, the Buick Invicta, the Buick Wildcat with the giant delta wings. I mean, the Tesla, one of the world's, most successful electric car vehicles. The Chevy Suburban, the longest running, American nameplate on automobile since the 1930s. All of that started with the humble Duryea that has largely been forgotten. Any American car company today owes its success to the 1893 Duryea Motor Wagon. Why, you may say? If Duryea brothers didn't grab the bull by the horns and jump the gun and be like, we're going to be the first Americans to build a car. We're going to be the first Americans to finish a race. We're going to be the first Americans to make an armored car. We're going to be the ones to sell the first 10 cars here in America. If they had not done that at the time that they did, and they waited for Ford to come around, Ford didn't build his car until 1896. And he didn't start mass producing cars until 1908 with the Ford Model T. So if he had waited for Ford to finally get his crap together and to actually do something, we would have been decades behind the Europeans. The fact that we are able to do this, the fact that I'm even able to have a car podcast, the fact about anything dealing with American cars, owes its success to the Duryea. He paved the road. He paved the road for the Grace Ransom E. Olds with the Oldsmobile Curve Dash Runabout in 1903. He paved the way for David Dunbar Buick for the Buick Motor Company in 1899. He paved the way for Henry M. Leland with the Cadillac Motor Company made from the remnants of the Henry Ford Company in 1903. He paved the way for Lincoln in 1917. He paved the way for Chrysler in 1925 or 1927 from the remnants of the Maxwell Car Company. I mean, he paved the way for all of the greats. Because if he had not introduced Americans to the idea of a homegrown and built automobile, they may have been so resistant that by the time someone else finally convinced them, we would have been way behind the Europeans. So this has been the GSMC Car Podcast. My goodness, I felt like I just preached a sermon. But this has been the GSMC Car Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this edition, to this podcast, part of our series of the most influential cars from every decade, the 1900s or next. So please follow us on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. We've got Twitter, we've got Instagram. We don't have Facebook yet, and we've got YouTube, and of course Apple Podcast, Spotify, Spreaker, those apps. Follow us, leave a like, leave a review. Please follow us on Instagram and Twitter so you can be, privy to, podcasts that are coming up, podcasts that have been now available. And just thank you so much for listening and have a good night. Thank you very much. Goodbye, folks.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.